John Dewey. Education. After all, pragmatism was not quite an American philosophy. It did not catch the spirit of the greater America that lay south and west of the New England states. It was a highly moralistic philosophy and betrayed the Puritanic origins of its author. It talked in one breath of practical results and matters of fact, and in the next it leaped with the speed of hope from earth to heaven. It began with a healthy reaction against metaphysics and epistemology, and one expected from it a philosophy of nature and of society. But it ended as an almost apologetic plea for the intellectual respectability of every dear belief. When would philosophy learn to leave to religion these perplexing problems of another life, and to psychology these subtle difficulties of the knowledge process, and give itself with all its strength to the illumination of human purposes and the coordination and elevation of human life? Circumstances left nothing undone to prepare John Dewey to satisfy this need and to outline a philosophy that should express the spirit of an informed and conscious America. He was born in the effete East, in Burlington, Vermont, 1859, and had his schooling there, as if to absorb the old culture before adventuring into the new. But soon he took Greeley's counsel and went west, teaching philosophy at the universities of Minnesota, 1888-9, Michigan, 1889-94, and Chicago, 1894-1904. Only then did he return east to join, and later to head, the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University. In his first 20 years, the Vermont environment gave him that almost rustic simplicity which characterized him even when all the world acclaimed him. And then, in his 20 years in the Middle West, he saw that vast America of which the Eastern mind is so proudly ignorant. He learned its limitations and its powers. And when he came to write his own philosophy, he gave to his students and his readers an interpretation of the sound and simple naturalism which underlies the superficial superstitions of the provinces of America. He wrote the philosophy, as Whitman wrote the poetry, not of one New English state, but of the continent. Dewey first caught the eyes of the world by his work in the School of Education at Chicago. It was in those years that he revealed the resolute experimental bent of his thought. And at the time of his death in 1952, his mind was still open to every new move in education, and his interest in the schools of tomorrow never flagged. Perhaps his greatest book was Democracy and Education. Here he drew the varied lines of his philosophy to a point, and centered them all on the task of developing a better generation. All progressive teachers acknowledge his leadership, and there is hardly a school in America that has not felt his influence. He was active everywhere in the task of remaking the schools of the world. He spent 2 years in China lecturing to teachers on the reform of education and made a report to the Turkish government on the reorganization of their national schools. Following up Spencer's demand for more science and less literature in education, Dewey added that even the science should not be book learning, but should come to the pupil from the actual practice of useful occupations. He had no great regard for a liberal education. The term was used originally to denote the culture of a free man, i.e. a man who never worked, and it was natural that such an education should be fitted rather to a leisure class in an aristocracy than to an industrial and democratic life. Now that we are nearly all of us caught up in the industrialization of Europe and America, the lessons we must learn are those that come through occupation rather than through books. Scholastic culture makes for snobbishness, but fellowship and occupation makes for democracy. In an industrial society, the school should be a miniature workshop and a miniature community. It should teach through practice and through trial and error the arts and discipline necessary for economic and social order. And finally, education must be reconceived, not as merely a preparation for maturity, whence our absurd idea that it should stop after adolescence, but as a continuous growth of the mind and a continuous illumination of life. In a sense, the schools can give us only the instrumentalities of mental growth. The rest depends upon our absorption and interpretation of experience. Real education comes after we leave school, and there is no reason why it should stop before our death. Instrumentalism. What distinguished Dewey was the undisguised completeness with which he accepted the evolution theory. Mind as well as body was to him an organ evolved, in the struggle for existence, from lower forms. His starting point in every field was Darwinian. When Descartes said, "The nature of physical things is much more easily conceived when they are beheld coming gradually into existence than when they are only considered as produced at once in a finished and perfect state," the modern world became self-conscious of the logic that was henceforth to control it, the logic of which Darwin's Origin of Species is the latest scientific achievement. When Darwin said of species what Galileo had said of the earth, "E pur si muove," he emancipated, once for all, genetic and experimental ideas as an organon of asking questions and looking for explanations. Things are to be explained, then, not by supernatural causation, but by their place and function in the environment. Dewey was frankly naturalistic. He protested that to idealize and rationalize the universe at large is a confession of inability to master the courses of things that specifically concern us. He distrusted, too, the Schopenhauerian will and the Bergsonian élan. These may exist, but there is no need to worship them, for these world forces are as often as not destructive of everything that man creates and reverences. Divinity is within us, not in these neutral cosmic powers. Intelligence has descended from its lonely isolation at the remote edge of things, whence it operated as unmoved mover and ultimate good, to take its seat in the moving affairs of men. We must be faithful to the earth. Like a good positivist, scion of the stock of Bacon and Hobbes and Spencer and Mill, Dewey rejected metaphysics as the echo and disguise of theology. The trouble with philosophy has always been that its problems were confused with those of religion. As I read Plato, philosophy began with some sense of its essentially political basis and mission, a recognition that its problems were those of the organization of a just social order. But it soon got lost in dreams of another world. In German philosophy, the interest in religious problems deflected the course of philosophic development. In English philosophy, the social interest outweighed the supernatural. For 2 centuries, the war raged between an idealism that reflected authoritarian religion and feudal aristocracy, and a sensationalism that reflected the liberal faith of a progressive democracy. This war is not yet ended, and therefore we have not quite emerged from the Middle Ages. The modern era will begin only when the naturalist point of view shall be adopted in every field. This does not mean that mind is reduced to matter, but only that mind and life are to be understood not in theological but in biological terms, as an organ or an organism in an environment, acted upon and reacting, molded and molding. We must study not states of consciousness, but modes of response. The brain is primarily an organ of a certain kind of behavior, not of knowing the world. Thought is an instrument of readaptation. It is an organ as much as limbs and teeth. Ideas are imagined contacts, experiments in adjustment. But this is no passive adjustment, no merely Spencerian adaptation. Complete adaptation to environment means death. The essential point in all response is the desire to control the environment. The problem of philosophy is not how we can come to know an external world, but how we can learn to control it and remake it, and for what goals. Philosophy is not the analysis of sensation and knowledge, for that is psychology, but the synthesis and coordination of knowledge and desire. To understand thought, we must watch it arise in specific situations. Reasoning, we perceive, begins not with premises, but with difficulties. Then it conceives an hypothesis which becomes the conclusion for which it seeks the premises. Finally, it puts the hypothesis to the test of observation or experiment. The first distinguishing characteristic of thinking is facing the facts, inquiry, minute and extensive scrutinizing, observation. There is small comfort for mysticism here. And then again, thinking is social. It occurs not only in specific situations, but in a given cultural milieu. The individual is as much a product of society as society is a product of the individual. A vast network of customs, manners, conventions, language, and traditional ideas lies ready to pounce upon every newborn child, to mold it into the image of the people among whom it has appeared. So rapid and thorough is the operation of this social heredity that it is often mistaken for physical or biological heredity. Even Spencer believed that the Kantian categories, or habits and forms of thought, were native to the individual, whereas in all probability they are merely the product of the social transmission of mental habits from adults to children. In general, the role of instinct has been exaggerated and that of early training underrated. The most powerful instincts, such as sex and pugnacity, have been considerably modified and controlled by social training. And there is no reason why other instincts, like those of acquisition and mastery, should not be similarly modified by social influence and education. We must unlearn our ideas about an unchangeable human nature and an omnipotent environment. There is no knowable limit to change or growth, and perhaps there is nothing impossible, but thinking makes it so. Science and Politics. What Dewey saw and reverenced as the finest of all things was growth, so much so that he made this relative but specific notion, and no absolute good, his ethical criterion. Not perfection as a final goal, but the ever-enduring process of perfecting, maturing, refining is the aim in living. The bad man is the man who, no matter how good he has been, is beginning to deteriorate, to grow less good. The good man is the man who, no matter how morally unworthy he has been, is moving to become better. Such a conception makes one severe in judging himself and humane in judging others. And to be good does not merely mean to be obedient and harmless. Goodness without ability is lame, and all the virtue in the world will not save us if we lack intelligence. Ignorance is not bliss, it is unconsciousness and slavery. Only intelligence can make us sharers in the shaping of our fates. Freedom of the will is no violation of causal sequences, it is the illumination of conduct by knowledge. A physician or engineer is free in his thoughts or his actions in the degree in which he knows what he deals with. Perhaps we find here the key to any freedom. Our trust must after all be in thought and not in instinct. How could instinct adjust us to the increasingly artificial environment which industry has built around us and the maze of intricate problems in which we are enmeshed? Physical science has for the time being far outrun psychical. We have mastered the physical mechanism sufficiently to turn out possible goods. We have not gained a knowledge of the conditions through which possible values become actual in life, and so are still at the mercy of habit, of haphazard, and hence of force. With tremendous increase in our control of nature, in our ability to utilize nature for human use and satisfaction, we find the actual realization of ends, the enjoyment of values, growing unassured and precarious. At times it seems as though we were caught in a contradiction. The more we multiply means, the less certain in general is the use we are able to make of them. No wonder a Carlyle or a Ruskin puts our whole industrial civilization under a ban, while a Tolstoy proclaims a return to the desert. But the only way to see the situation steadily and see it whole is to keep in mind that the entire problem is one of the development of science and its application to life. Morals, philosophy, returns to its first love of the wisdom that is nurse of good. But it returns to the Socratic principle equipped with a multitude of special methods of inquiry and tests. With an organized mass of knowledge, and with control of the arrangements by which industry, law, and education may concentrate upon the problem of the participation by all men and women, up to the capacity of absorption, in all attained values. Unlike most philosophers, Dewey accepted democracy, though he knew its faults. The aim of political order is to help the individual to develop himself completely, and this can come only when each shares up to his capacity in determining the policy and destiny of his group. Fixed classes belong with fixed species. The fluidity of classes came at the same time as the theory of the transformation of species. Aristocracy and monarchy are more efficient than democracy, but they are also more dangerous. Dewey distrusted the state and wished a pluralistic order, in which as much as possible of the work of society would be done by voluntary associations. He saw in the multiplicity of organizations, parties, corporations, trade unions, etc., a reconciliation of individualism with common action. As these develop in importance, the state tends to become more and more a regulator and adjuster among them, defining the limits of their actions, preventing and settling conflicts. Moreover, the voluntary associations do not coincide with political boundaries. Associations of mathematicians, chemists, astronomers, business corporations, labor organizations, churches, are transnational because the interests they represent are worldwide. In such ways as these, internationalism is not an aspiration but a fact, not a sentimental ideal but a force. Yet these interests are cut across and thrown out of gear by the traditional doctrine of exclusive national sovereignty. It is the vogue of this doctrine or dogma that presents the strongest barrier to the effective formation of an international mind, which alone agrees with the moving forces of present-day labor, commerce, science, art, and religion. But political reconstruction will come only when we apply to our social problems the experimental methods and attitudes which have succeeded so well in the natural sciences. We are still in the metaphysical stage of political philosophy. We fling abstractions at one another's heads, and when the battle is over, nothing is won. We cannot cure our social ills with wholesale ideas, magnificent generalizations like individualism or order, democracy or monarchy or aristocracy or whatnot. We must meet each problem with a specific hypothesis and no universal theory. Theories are tentacles, and fruitful progressive living must rely on trial and error. The experimental attitude substitutes detailed analysis for wholesale assertions, specific inquiries for temperamental convictions, small facts for opinions whose size is in precise ratio to their vagueness. It is within the social sciences, in morals, politics, and education, that thinking still goes on by large antitheses, by theoretical oppositions of order and freedom, individualism and socialism, culture and utility, spontaneity and discipline, actuality and tradition. The field of the physical sciences was once occupied by similar total views, whose emotional appeal was inversely as their intellectual clarity. But with the advance of the experimental method, the question has ceased to be which one of two rival claimants has a right to the field. It has become a question of clearing up a confused subject matter by attacking it bit by bit. I do not know a case where the final result was anything like victory for one or another among the pre-experimental notions. All of them disappeared because they became increasingly irrelevant to the situation discovered, and with their detected irrelevance they became unmeaning and uninteresting. It is in this field, in this application of human knowledge to our social antagonisms, that the work of philosophy should lie. Philosophy clings like a timid spinster to the old-fashioned problems and ideas. Direct preoccupation with contemporary difficulties is left to literature and politics. Philosophy is in flight today before the sciences, one after another of which have run away from her into the productive world, until she is left chill and alone, like a forsaken mother with the vitals gone from her and almost all her cupboards empty. Philosophy has withdrawn herself timidly from her real concerns, men and their life in the world, into a crumbling corner called epistemology, and is in danger every moment of being ousted by the laws that prohibit habitation in flimsy and rickety structures. But these old problems have lost their meaning for us. We do not solve them, we get over them. They evaporate in the heat of social friction and living change. Philosophy, like everything else, must secularize itself. It must stay on the earth and earn its keep by illuminating life. What serious-minded men not engaged in the professional business of philosophy most want to know is what modifications and abandonments of intellectual inheritance are required by the newer industrial, political, and scientific movements. The task of future philosophy is to clarify men's ideas as to the social and moral strifes of their own day. Its aim is to become, so far as is humanly possible, an organ for dealing with these conflicts. A catholic and far-sighted theory of the adjustment of the conflicting factors of life is philosophy. A philosophy so understood might at last produce philosophers worthy to be kings. Conclusion. If the reader will now summarize for himself these three philosophies, he will perhaps see more justice than at first in that disregard of chronology which placed Santayana before James and Dewey. It is clearer in retrospect that the most eloquent and subtle of our living thinkers belongs almost wholly to the cultural traditions of Europe, that William James, though attached in many ways to that tradition, caught the spirit of at least the Eastern America in his thinking and the spirit of all America in his style, and that John Dewey, product of East and West alike, has given philosophic form to the realistic and democratic temper of his people. It becomes evident that our ancient dependence on European thought is lessening, that we are beginning to do our own work in philosophy, literature, and science, and in our own way. Merely beginning, of course, For we are still young, and we have not yet learned to walk entirely without the assistance of our European ancestry. But if we find it hard to surpass ourselves, and are sometimes discouraged with our own superficiality, our provincialism, our narrowness, and our bigotry, our immature intolerance, and our timid violence against innovation and experiment, let us remember that England needed 800 years between her foundation and her Shakespeare, and that France needed 800 years between her foundation and her Montaigne. We have drawn to us from Europe and selected for survival and imitation among ourselves rather the initiative individualist and the acquisitive pioneer than the meditative and artistic souls. We have had to spend our energies in clearing our great forests and tapping the wealth of our soil. We have had no time yet to bring forth a native literature and a mature philosophy. But we have become wealthy, and wealth is the prelude to art. In every country where centuries of physical effort have accumulated the means for luxury and leisure, culture has followed as naturally as vegetation grows in a rich and watered soil. To have become wealthy was the first necessity. A people, too, must live before it can philosophize. No doubt we have grown faster than nations usually have grown, and the disorder of our souls is due to the rapidity of our development. We are like youths, disturbed and unbalanced for a time by the sudden growth and experiences of puberty. But soon our maturity will come, our minds will catch up with our bodies, our culture with our possessions. Perhaps there are greater souls than Shakespeare's, and greater minds than Plato's, waiting to be born. When we have learned to reverence liberty as well as wealth, we too shall have our Renaissance.